And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome to Open Connection. I'm your host, Robert Pictou. Our show today comes to you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Tsimshian people. Translated as the heart of the Nisga'a house crest, the design was inspired by traditional Nisga'a longhouses, feast dishes, and canoes. The Nisga'a Museum opened in Lac Voisap in the spring of 2011. On today's Open Connection, Museum Director and Curator Teresa Schober.
I had wanted to be an archaeologist from the time I was about 12. And so that's what I went to school for and was formally trained in, and then shifted to museum work while I was teaching at a university in South Florida. My father had been someone who had a lot of wanderlust and traveled a lot, and we traveled when I was a kid. And I think that exposure to people from different places and seeing that things can be done differently successfully was probably in the back of my mind, and so I was very interested in that. I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Calgary, and at the time I was there, which isn't true for people to have experiences today, there were literally 7 of us in my graduating class, and so all of us had done a tremendous amount of field research before we graduated with our undergraduate degrees. And I think that's a little more unusual today. There's a lot more people that go to school and a lot less opportunity maybe for any one individual. NAGPRA is Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, and it was passed in 1990. It's a U.S. federal law. And then following that, states adopted laws that followed along with that federal legislation. So there's state and federal law in the U.S. It was really impactful to the field of anthropology, biological anthropology. People, I think, had lost course a little bit. There was, beginning really much earlier, but in the 1950s in the United States, massive transportation projects. There was a highway system enacted, and in the Eisenhower era, the interstate system. And that involved moving a whole lot of land and disturbing a whole lot of First Nations mortuary sites. And prior to 1990, if you excavated human remains and they were First Nations, they went to a museum to study or to researchers to study, compared to if they were Euro-American, African-American, or any other ethnicity. And that divide between how remains were treated wasn't course corrected until that 1990 legislation. But it took a really long time for there to be a response. I mean, there was some initial response. I had mentioned to you earlier that for a time when I was in graduate school, I worked for the Army Corps of Engineers Research Labs in Champaign, Illinois. And one of the things I did as a graduate student was write reports about what we knew or what we could glean from the historical record and documentary record about the locations of cultural groups in the past, so that if military installations inadvertently discovered human remains, they'd know who to contact. And that was one of the outgrowths, but 30-some years later, there's still a lot of institutions in the United States with ancestral remains, and momentum is shifting, but it's taken a really long time for descendant communities to get their ancestors.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Thank you for staying with us. A curator is responsible for the care, management, and interpretation of collections in museums, galleries, libraries, and other cultural institutions. Their role involves a combination of research, preservation, exhibit planning, and educational outreach. Let us return to the conversation as Teresa shares how COVID impacted her job.
So when I came here, the person who was my supervisor sort of drove up into the driveway of the little house I have here in the village and passed me a bag with a computer and a phone through the window, and we were on remote work for months We worked at the museum for a couple of months in 2020, and then we were on remote work until the following year. We were able to reopen the museum for about 100 days, and then we went back on remote work. So in that context of like, who's the stranger in our community, I don't know that many people saw me in those first 2 years, because of course we were all on a fairly strict lockdown because it was so critical to preserve the health of everyone in the community, but elders in particular.
So tell me about those first few days of work.
Well, that's an interesting. So I had come up in December of before I moved, and had a chance to see the collection, meet with the staff, and certainly had read about the museum, had read a copy of the Nisga'a final agreement, and had kind of done a little bit of research. That doesn't parallel with actually, being directly involved and seeing it open day to day. And one of the things that I think was interesting was that typically where I would serve as a museum director in Florida, I was considered to be a subject matter expert in the archaeology or the history or whatever it was. And part of coming here was letting go of the idea that that was my role, which I'm not going to pretend was easy, but I could intellectualize it, but you still feel it, right? Because truly I'm not the one that bears the knowledge for what the meaning is and the use is of the cultural belongings in this space. And so during COVID, that was challenging just because there was no opportunity to really interface with those knowledge holders so that I could could gain an understanding of what this place really means to the community, and how we as the museum can move forward and improve and do things differently that keeps that original vision in mind, but also meets and serves the needs of the community. So it really wasn't until we started to open, which we did for a brief window in 2021, and that wasn't really a window because there was not a lot of travel, and so our numbers were really low, and I couldn't see what it meant for it to operate, and so last year was really informative in that regard, and so we focused first on just being really consistent in our operations and staying true to that initial vision, and trying to do some other sorts of side projects that weren't about interpretation or about changing anything about the core vision of the museum, but were just about kind of supporting efforts that might come down the line in the future.
How does it feel to kind of walk through these doors here and you kind of see history of a nation?
I think that's a great question. I think more than one thing about that, I feel a tremendous responsibility to be a steward, to learn as much as I can so that I can find a path to be helpful. But I also am curious, because I think there's people who have passed that I would have loved to sit down and learn from about how the decisions were made about what belongings would return. This space, both in terms of being on Nisga'a land, but also in terms of what belongings were desired to return, and what those early community leaders and stakeholders and elders made decisions when they saw the vast amount of cultural belongings that were in institutions, predominantly the Canadian Museum of History and the Royal BC Museum. They had to make decisions about what they wanted to come back most and what messages they wanted to share, and that plays out through the experience at the museum. The museum had a vision. Those early stakeholders and elders very much wanted people to experience this the way information is passed and knowledge is gained in Nisga'a communities, which is through an oral interface, storytelling, interfacing with a community member that is helping you see things from a different set of eyes. And so each summer, Nisga'a Museum brings in up to 6 youth in the community, youth and young adults, that share those stories. And so people have a guided and personal experience here, that they're aided to see more than cultural belonging as an object, like a rattle, or a work of art. Because while they have functions and they are incredibly masterfully crafted, they also have such deeper meaning. And seeing that and hearing that, learning that through the eyes of community members is a really special part of this museum.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Welcome back to Open Connection. Composed of chiefs, matriarchs, and respected Nisga'a elders, the Council of Elders is appointed by the Nisga'a Lissam's government. The Nisga'a have always governed themselves according to the traditional laws and practices of the Nisga'a Nation. Let us return to the conversation as Teresa shares about some feedback at a recent gathering of elders at the museum. Most communities that have a museum, there are items that are gathered from around the world, and they're brought there. Where this one's kind of a little different because these are items that are coming back home, and then now the community actually gets to see items that clan members and family members have. Have you had the opportunity to sit down with some of those community members and they have them share about these items in this museum?
Yes, to some degree. So one of the things that was a beautiful thing last summer was that the Council of Elders, that is an advisory committee for the Ayuk Nisga'a department, had met here at the museum. And at the end of their couple of days of meeting, they toured through the museum with the youth and young adults that were working here that summer so that they could all interface and share stories. And so the youth from the museum were sharing some of the stories that they share, and then the elders were sharing with them their stories as well. I didn't participate in that tour, and I don't give tours at Nisga'a Museum. Because to me that's their cultural space, and if they invite me in to share a story, that's wonderful, and I appreciate that opportunity to learn. But I don't consider my role to be that. I'm not at that juncture where they should be sharing those things necessarily with me. I mean, I don't resist it if they wish to, but to me it's the sharing between youth and the community and their elders that's one of the most wonderful bonds that the museum has the opportunity to help encourage.
Now, just down the road, about a couple hours or so, is Terrace, and they have Coast Mountain College. In Coast Mountain College, there is a part that's the Frida Diesen School of Fine Art, and they have students. They come up here, I understand, and they kind of stop here to kind of get an idea or a feeling on how things were made. What are some of the reactions of the students when they come through this building?
Well, I think I've managed to not be here when that particular class has come each time, though I've spoken to some of the instructors from the Frida Diesen School, and we're always grateful to have them come and view the cultural belongings that are here. There are a number of students in the Frida Diesen program who are Nisga'a, and they come sometimes on their own to see and learn from their ancestors. So we encourage that, and it's just a fantastic opportunity. We also, one of the things that we have done is to help encourage young artists and art entrepreneurs is that we prioritize Nisga'a artists and art entrepreneurs in the museum store so that they have a place where a little bit of awareness can be raised of them and their work. Not that we're the only place that does that, but as an avenue to showcase some of their talents. So it's kind of an interesting experience because it's coming full circle, right? There was cultural disruption for a number of reasons in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and some of those practices that would have been taught generation to generation to generation now have these other paths. But it's a beautiful thing that there have been, that people have found those paths to adapt and to still learn and to then now reinvigorate those traditions and pass them on.
Open Connection will be right back after these messages. And now, from the CFTK-TV studios, this is Open Connection with your host, Robert Pictou.
Repatriation is return of cultural property to the originating country, community, family, or individual. Some cultural property may have been taken from its original owners through illegal or unethical ways. Repatriation of cultural property is an important part of acknowledging and reconciling the unjust ways many First Nations people were treated in the past. In this final segment of Open Connection, Tricia shares how the museum helps the Nisga'a Nation.
Currently, the museum doesn't have any requests that have been submitted to other institutions. We have done some exploratory work, and we're continuing with that work so that we can know or assist families in knowing where their cultural belongings may have gone. That's going to take a long time. There's a lot of institutions that were collectors, takers, that have cultural belongings in their possession, and it's a bit of work to kind of pull together some of those records. And so we've been building towards that over the last couple of years, and it'll take us quite a few more to get a handle on just the volume of cultural belongings that are elsewhere and where they're held, and then provide that information to families to best support them for what it is they would like to see return.
If you could reach out there and if someone knows, where there may be an item that could or could not be Nisga'a, how would they go about getting a hold of you, or how do they contact the museum?
Well, so do you want me to list our phone number and email address? So the museum can be reached at area code 250-633-3050. And our email address, our general email address, is nisgaamuseum@nisgaanation.ca. And so we encourage people to reach out. And some private individuals have, where they have cultural belongings or early artworks that they purchased or their families purchased 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, and or received as gifts, and want to find paths for them to make it back to the artist or make it back to the museum. And we do our best to put people in touch based on that. We would also encourage institutions that have cultural belongings that are Nisga'a to reach out to us. The onus shouldn't really be on First Nations, Indigenous people to find all of their belongings that were taken. It really should be on the institutions that have staffs that can assist with that effort and can make that first contact and put together that information and send it on. That would be incredibly helpful.
Because really, any good museum curator would know what they have in storage, right?
Some of these institutions have collections that are so vast that that's not even possible.
MLA Ellis Ross, and he was talking about trying to find strategies on bringing back some Haisla art that are in private collections, because private collections are totally different than public collections. Is that right?
Yeah, that's very true. Many public institutions today have repatriation policies, so they've crafted policies about how they collaborate with and how they provide materials back to Indigenous peoples. Private collectors aren't subject to the same kind of scrutiny, which is really too bad, right? Because some things that might be highly culturally significant would have gone into private hands and might still be there, and there's not necessarily knowledge of where those cultural belongings are.
And is there anything I might have missed that you'd like to add?
Well, we would love to invite people to come and visit the museum. So typically the museum has, it's open year-round, but I'd like to explain that. We are open regular business hours between Victoria Day weekend in May and the Thanksgiving holiday in October. And typically in that time we're open 5 or 7 days a week, depending on the time of the particular month. This time of year we're normally closed so that we can do inventory and do some deep cleaning and that kind of thing. But because of the return of the Wilpes Nisga'a memorial pole a few weeks ago, the museum reopened for 3 weeks because we had to close prematurely in order to get ready to raise the pole inside the museum. And so right now, people have a chance to come to the museum between Wednesday and Sunday, 10 to 5, through the end of October, so they can visit and reflect and get a tour of the permanent collection and also see the raised Wilpes Nisga'a memorial pole that the family led the effort on having returned here to the Nass Valley. And so I would tell people to come on by.
Any of the opening events here in Kitimat today?
The opening events, as you mentioned, did get underway this morning at the Kitimat Works. 40 years ago, Alcan poured its first aluminum ingot. Times have changed since then. Certainly, much of the technology has, but many of those who were here at the beginning were here again to watch the current works manager and director of operations, Eric Sykes, and Alcan Smelters and Chemicals president, Claude Chamberlain, pour the commemorative ingot this morning. Later, Alcan dedicated a memorial to all the workers who have worked at this operation during the 40 years in Kitimat. And 2 of the men who were here from the very beginning were here again to dedicate that memorial.
Let this memorial be a constant reminder to all those that view it of the dedication and effort of those that built and started the smelter complex.
Oddly enough, Roy Dean's first day of employment here at Alcan's Kitimat Works was in August 1954, and he's still an employee. But he realizes times have changed in Kitimat.
When I come in here, everything was new, everything was mud. The town site, they were just building it, and it was ferocious mud piles up there, and the roads like this. They were just building the Kitimat River Bridge. Line 1 was going, and they were just getting ready to start line 2. They had just poured the first ingot the day before I arrived. But being young, I guess, and adventurous, I decided I'd stay a while. I thought maybe a year, but I ended up buying a house, bringing the wife up, raising a family, and we've been here ever since. And they've been good years.
The Commando Completion Project was mentioned today during the speeches honoring the 40th anniversary of Alcan celebrations, and the power commitments to BC Hydro was brought up. Now those power commitments are due to kick in 1995, whether or not Commando Completion is online. Well, obviously KCP won't be online then. That means that the company may have to curtail some production, but the company also made a promise to its full-time employees.
In the unlikely event that we have to curtail production in Kitimat in the short term to meet a contract that is an integral part of completing Commando project, no one currently employed full-time at Kitimat Works or Commando Power Operations will lose his or her job as a result of that.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Open Connection. The greatest distance in the existence of man is not from here to there, but the connection from his mind and heart. If we can conquer that distance, we can soar like an eagle and realize our immensity within. I'm Robert Pictou.